extra pressure here. And of course, I'm not really reporting on any recent research projects I've been carrying out. What I thought I'd do is, given these new perspectives we are developing during this conference, and it all being part, of course, of the Blumenbach online digitization project, what perhaps we need is, with our novel insights and revisionism, perhaps attempt a new narrative that makes it possible both to bring our story more easily out in the open among colleagues, but perhaps also the public, and it may guide us as well in putting our materials in the internet. I recall the debate we had after the first session between Paul, Gerhard, and Martin about we ought to be aware of the fact that digitizing isn't distilling and putting in a stratosphere of objectivity data. No, we are really putting forward a located picture, and the important thing is we ought to be aware of that location, what we are doing with it, what we are attempting to say with it. I think that is the important thing. So I'm interested perhaps in a new narrative, a new story within which we can place both the anti-racists as a clear element of the story. That hasn't taken place yet in the literature. But then also ask the question, if not Blumenbach, who else? So we need to try and answer these questions and do this. Now, the current, most widely accepted narrative of the origins of scientific racism, and I restrict myself to scientific racism and shall define that as well, because it is science that has become the arbiter of truth, rather than theology, philosophy, or what have you. So that's the important thing, was given its present-day form in the post-World War II period. And as we know, this narrative identifies Blumenbach and his doctoral dissertation as the scientific fountainhead of racism. Now, among those who shaped this narrative were the British, Polish-born polymath Jakob Bronowski. Let me just put my watch here so that I can sort of see. Jakob Bronowski, and of course the US evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Gould. In a highly acclaimed BBC documentary and the accompanying book, we have Bronowski and the documentary, The Ascent of Man, which was first presented in 1973, Bronowski propounded that when through the 1930s the shadow of Nazi racism began darkening Europe, already for over a century a cloud had hung over Göttingen in the form of Blumenbach's collection and his definition of races. Gould then, as we know from Juncker and others, in his equally acclaimed The Mismeasure of Man, went further, accusing Blumenbach of the shift from a geographic to a hierarchical ordering of human diversity. And I think that's a good definition. And he continued that marked a fateful transition in the history of Western science leading to the Holocaust. And this is interesting to observe. The current narrative of scientific racism takes place in the first place, not only, but in the first place, in the context of the Holocaust, not of transatlantic slavery primarily anymore, somewhere in some places, not in that political context, but of recent, relatively recent German history. And so here, just to show you, gosh, two great guys, may I say, whose work I admire, but on this point we are in disagreement. There we have our Gould and his Mismeasure of Man. Now, to point the finger of accusation at Blumenbach for being the main wellspring of scientific racism, we already have discussed that, we believe this is incorrect and unjustified. And gosh, I wasn't quite sure if we would get Thomas Junker's illustration, so I shall be quick here. And this, of course, is the original. And there we have, yeah, I agree with you, it's a fabrication. Now, you can say I'm trying to explain my point with it, but this is a fabrication by any criteria. Gosh, Haeckel didn't do anything worse, right? So Blumenbach, several of his students, as well as some of his colleagues, classified humanity's morphological variety in a geographical way, horizontally, not vertically, as taxonomists do. And as such, they developed a physical anthropology within the geographical cartographic paradigm of universal history, initiated here at Göttingen by Gatter and his wonderful maps, which you find the originals in the library here beneath. A paradigm made internationally popular by Blumenbach's student Alexander von Humboldt, and of course Humboldt's cartographer friend Heinrich Berghaus. Now, in cartographically classifying human variety, these men were not racists. But they followed, however, and we have been dealing a little bit with, was he quite that clean? But not racist unclean, if you see what I mean. This is, and I want to bring both aspects in. We have to be able to deal with the conceit of these guys, which they really had. Come on now. So in doing that, they followed the common trend of Eurocentrism, the fashion of cultural conceit that accompanies national, economic, and military power, a conceit that today, I would argue, is present, sorry to my American colleagues, in the US, in its almost nationalist ideology of American exceptionalism. Eurocentrism was the same sort of thing. Such conceit may be reprehensible, but it need not be racist, however ramshackle, I think, the intellectual scaffolding of centristic and exceptionalist constructions was and continues to be. So here we have from Heinrich Berghaus's Anthropographische Atlas, one of the maps, and they summarize this Blumenbachian, Humboldtian, cartographic classification of variety. And it's done for all sorts of things, but you see two, I'll show that in the next picture, but you see it already in this picture, that we are dealing here really not with a taxonomic classification or hierarchy. You have the Caucasians in the top right and the American Indians at the same level in the top left, because it's closest sort of to the areas of the world map in the center, and then two races on one side, and somewhat a mixture, perhaps two more on the other, perhaps just one. So that was being debated in the 30s when Berghaus made this as an basically preparation for an accompaniment to Humboldt's Cosmos. Now, gosh, the insets are interesting too, but no time. But here you see another one, the next map sort of in that atlas. And when do we see again a world map of human variety, but focused on something cultural such as clothing. And there again is a ranking, but not a taxonomic ranking, a somewhat different one from Blumenbach's five races. And what do we see? It is according to how naked you are versus how clothed, whether the clothes are woolen or just skins or cotton. And what do we see? In the center here, Paris, a Parisian gentleman. And then a little bit here, sort of other parts of Europe and so on. You see, there is this preoccupation with Eurocentricity and the classification of variety in that context. It involved also physical variety. Now, yeah, conceit, no two ways about it. If they want to be civilized, they ought to come to us. But what do we do today in the United States different? You see, there is that attitude to off-centrism. Some of them thought indeed it's idealistic, we educate the rest, we bring them to us, we help them, we are generous missionaries and all that, we just spoke about that. But this is not scientific racism in the sense that Gould was defining it and that I like to keep as a definition. So to repeat, Blumenbach's physical anthropology was conceived within a geographical paradigm known in the post-World War II period as Humboldtian science, not in a taxonomic paradigm that involved Gould's hierarchical ordering. Just as a footnote maybe, in his study of feral children, in particular Wild Peter, or Peter the Wild Boy of Hamel nearby here, Blumenbach specifically asserted that through upartung, through degeneration, and we've talked about it, a truly wild human being, an animalistic human being, could not be generated. Humans, all of them, he said, are innately domesticated. So there is that boundary, you see. There's not the connection, the Gouldian taxonomic connection of humanity with animality. Doesn't exist. So, I repeat, urgently needed, I think, is the development of a new revisionist narrative of the history of racism, one that highlights scientific anti-racism, such as people as Blumenbach and especially Tiedemann. How come there is no biography on Tiedemann? It's a scandal. That man is a genius hero of an ideology we all support. Why do we accuse Blumenbach rather than heroify him to a certain extent, and especially not heroify Tiedemann? Come on. One of our students all too soon. And then, there you go. So, as I said, of course, we also need to continue identifying the racists. And in this context, it's essential to pose the question, if not Blumenbach, who else? If Bronowski and Gould are wrong, who then is the scientist, or were the scientists, who gave scientific credibility, necessity even, to that notorious hierarchical ordering of human diversity? And here I propose the answer to that question, and it is Thomas Henry Huxley. I've talked about this once or twice before, and people do not like this. I understand that, because there is a worry about maligning Darwinians, as in North America, that may give fodder to the creationist attacks on them. Now, this is not meant to help the creationists, let me be very clear, but we should have, just as we should have the courage to make Blumenbach and the Blumenbachians conceited Eurocentrics, and accept the ugliness of that in some ways. We should also have the courage to say, if the Darwinians aren't always quite as clean and mama white as most of their statues are, when they aren't, we should admit that too and accept that. So, let us be clear now about what we mean by scientific racism. There has been much intellectual sloppiness in this crucial matter. There were, of course, many non-scientific scholars as well as scientists who have expressed prejudices about otherness, from Henry Hume, Lord Keynes, to Minus, to Gobineau, and to others. These guys were racists, but not scientific racists. What scientific racism does, and here I expand Gould's definition a bit, it constructs on the basis of collections and professional work, not merely of prejudice. The basis of collections and professional work. A hierarchical taxonomy of biological differences between human varieties, the lower forms being dehumanized and in fact animalized by a linkage of certain human varieties to the higher apes. That's in concreto what it is. Two further concepts need to be clarified. We've already talked about them. Monogamy, maybe I should say monoganism, so people don't think I'm saying monogamy, but monogamy and polygyny, both of which nearly always are imperfectly understood in the secondary literature. Each of the two, namely other complexities, but let me just mention, each of the two took on three different forms, namely a creationist form, an autochthonist form, which was a sort of semi-evolutionary form, and later also a clear evolutionary form, all three. And it's important in many cases to ask yourself which form you are dealing with. The monogamists, who believed in the unity of humankind, tended to be non-racist, and abolitionist tended. Blumenbach was a monogamist, most likely of the autochthonist kind, not creationist. Scientific racism emerged by and large within the polygamist camp, gaining clear, mature contours through the middle of the 19th century. I guess we could say that the US physician and naturalist Samuel George Morton was a polygamist racist, most likely two of the autochthonist kind, interesting. However, autochthony lost ground during the 1850s to be replaced by the evolutionary model, especially the Darwinian Lyellian model. Now, the infamous, let me see if there's already a relevant next slide. Oh, I'd forgotten to show you that. This is rather nice. Also one of these Humboldtian maps, showing once again that fascination, preoccupation, obsession, I would say, with Eurocentrism and Eurocentric conceit. You see here you get three divisions of land and sea on Earth. Two are familiar to us, at the top, Eastern and Western Hemisphere, on the sides, North and South. But then, for a while, very, very popular in the 19th century, you see the division of the largest amount of dry land and the largest area of oceanic water. Now, why were they fascinated in that? And we no longer have these maps in our school atlases. And it was that by having this hemisphere, you could credibly define a center of the Earth on a round globe. And guess where the center is? It's, of course, in Europe, even in Northern Europe, even in Northwestern Europe. The Brits say it's in Cornwall, the Germans say much nearer to Berlin, the French say very close to Paris, you know. So you see here that conceit which legitimates geographically European hegemony. There again, you have to concede, so it has real consequences, you see? So, but that's another good map, and one could go on. I think this paradigm is powerful. We should really place Blumenbach in that context. He was one of the generators of it. And Robert Knox, there again, very conceited. But Knox, too, a bit of a Blumenbachian, and there the European is in the center, not at the. You see, it's not, once again, not a taxonomic way of thinking. Now, the infamous clash between Richard Owen, whom we have here, with his magnum bonum, as it was jocularly called by the Brits, thigh bone of an extinct bird. The infamous clash between Richard Owen and Thomas Henry Huxley, which took place during the early 1860s and is known as the hippocampus controversy. We've heard about hippocampus from Bob already. It represented a clash over the question of the origin of Homo sapiens, pitching Owen's monogamist, megamutational, and anti-racist model against Huxley's polygenetic, Darwinian, and deeply racist model. In the course of and in the wake of this clash, racism was given, this is my thesis, racism was given its late modern 19th century and early 20th century scientific definition in the form of what became known as Huxley's law, or more accurately, Huxley's rule. Now, so briefly on Owen's Blumenbachian position here. Owen, let me see, I have to skip a little here, good. So surreptitiously introducing into English science a Germanic theory of organic evolution, a mutational, mega-mutational model, Owen was concerned to preserve the Blumenbachian notion of humankind's unity and of its separateness from anthropoid apes. He demonstrated the man-animal's gap in the form of cross-sections of the skulls of humans and apes, also using for the same purpose other anatomical features such as the muscles and tendons in the human foot compared with those of the gorilla. Owen likened the process of evolution, implicitly also the evolution of humans, to metagenesis, a form of metamorphosis, where you get a sudden jump in form from a caterpillar to a butterfly, for example. And he said, you know, major changes from animals to humans happen that way. And so you cannot look for links, or it's useless. We could go into that because he got that notion in part in discussions with or interactions with Schopenhauer, the philosopher, another follower of Blumenbach. I better be quick. Good. Okay. So here we have Huxley, a cartoon from Vanity Fair. And here we have that important picture. Perhaps I shouldn't read too much anymore, that takes too much time. Here we have that important picture of Owen showing this gap. And here you see 1 and 2, a Caucasian skull and a skull, let's say, from race number 5 in the Blumenbachian classification. And he's arguing there's very little difference, there's variety, but there's very little difference. Where do we get the gap? When you continue 3 and 4, the gorilla and the orang, and Owen himself was the first to do gorilla anatomy. He just had gotten the first specimens in London from du Chaillu, the French explorer. So there he places that gap. This is accurate stuff. There's nothing, I think, falsified here or fabricated, and it's a remarkable argument in support of the Blumenbachian position. Then he adds, Tiedemannian-like, a contrast not only of skull, but also of brain, and showing the extraordinary extent of the difference between skull of a Negro and a gorilla, just as Tiedemann had done, but additionally also the brain, in particular showing the posterior horn and the hippocampus, the human hippocampus, highly developed in humans, more than in apes, and so much more that Owen gave it its own name, hippocampus. But then, rather tricky, I must say, there Huxley tripped him up, then said only humans have a hippocampus, which is true if you define the largest development of it as hippocampus. But that was a little tricky. That was a play on terminology. And so he also compared the musculature of feet, here of a gorilla and here of a human, and look at this tendon that makes it possible to pirouette. No such architecture of musculature and tendons, but an enormous difference there. And so Huxley says we can't have any of these big differences in Darwinian theory. They need to be far smaller. So he creates these form sequences in skulls and in brains. And here you see a very artificial skull morphological sequence of half apes and apes, monkeys and apes. And then, of course, the lowest human. Now, Blumenbach's race number 5 isn't a geographical variety, it now has become a taxonomic entity linking animals to humans. But now comes Huxley's rule. It goes on, and he says, the argument becomes that he says, look here, the difference between the lowest and the highest shaped ape, half-ape ape, is much larger than between the highest ape and the lowest human. So therefore, while we're accepting a kind of relationship between all those, the relationship with humans must be even tighter. So he animalizes parts of humanity and creates lower and higher categories. He does it also the other way around, and he fights with Owen here about a hippocampus. I can't go into the details except to show that he played often tricks like Gould did. Here you see a comparison of the chimpanzee's brain with a human brain. They look rather similar. Why? Because he's made them much larger, the chimpanzee brain, than it really is. Tricky stuff, you know. And then he says, sometimes in his captions, yeah, that's what I've done to make my argument clearer. It's called fabrication. That's what Gould did. So, and do you see, while Owen said, look at the muscular and tendons, he ignored that and uses only this evidence, the bone evidence, which is sort of, you know, helpful in a Darwinian way. Carl Vogt does the same, and he particularly focuses on brains. And here you have now with brains Huxley's rule, and it's the other way around. Oh no, well, it's also the other way around. It's bipolar. And so what do you have here now? A sequence from, at the top there, a half ape, or rather monkey, then the chimpanzee, here the brain of Saartje Baartman, the Hottentot woman brought to London where she died, and this is her brain. And here the brain of Gauss. So the highest human known, the lowest human known, according to Huxley, compared to the highest and lowest apes. And what do you see? Again, Huxley's rule, it says, the difference between the lowest and the highest ape is bigger than the highest ape and the lowest human, the other way around. 2, the difference between Gauss and Saartje Baartman is bigger than Saartje Baartman and the gorilla from the London, or the chimpanzee from the London Zoo. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Huxley's rule. That establishes as an integral, necessary part of Darwinian theory applied to human evolution, racism. That's what I mean by saying with Huxley's rule, it becomes scientific racism, and it has consequences. And Haeckel, he defines it, perhaps no more time. Good, then I skip this, but this is sort of Haeckel defining Huxley's rule, widely known and you know, publicized. Here he illustrates it just very quickly. Lowest monkey, highest human, even there. We have another Apollo figure there for the Caucasians. The conceit, once again. The conceit is there anyhow. But then you see the argument again. The difference between 12 and 7 is less than between 7, no, is more, and they are related, is more than between 7 and 6. So they must be even more related. And the difference between 1 and 6 is bigger than 6 and 7. So they are less related. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Darwinian evolution. This is Huxley's rule. It's a critical part of the theory. Here, we really have racism becoming part of science with real consequences. I can't go into all the details, just the last picture, but it is a consequence, and it shows how dramatic. Sorry, where are we? There. Ota Benga in the monkey house at the Bronx Zoo. to demonstrate Huxley's rule. You see, the lowest human they had imported is displaced as belonging on the other side of the fence. This is animalization and shows Huxley's rule. It's staggering and deeply sad, and of course he was human enough that a little later he committed suicide, which animals tend not to do. No, but so just as an illustration, and of course this was no exception, but it's staggering, staggering. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, so what I'm trying to do, quite apart from talking a bit about Huxley's rule, which relates to my Owen work, but once again, had to encourage us to structure a new story, a new narrative that heroifies the anti-racists we are increasingly identifying, and more clearly identify the origins of scientific racism and not be afraid of sometimes throwing a rotten egg at the statue of a Darwinian. Thank you.